Hello and welcome to Inside View. My name is Cory Burnell and I will be your host for this episode. And we are once again joined by our Congressman, Tom McClintock. Congressman, welcome again.
Well, thank you again.
Well, we've covered so much in our previous episode, and we're going to talk a little bit today in this episode about some of those topics we couldn't cover in our first half hour. We had just kind of ended on the topic of bureaucracy, bureaucratic reform, regulatory reform in Washington, and so many Americans are impacted not just by laws that Congress passes, but by rules and regulations that bureaucracies and agencies pass. And these seem to be monsters that just get larger and larger and larger over time to where the burden becomes immense. In my industry of investment and financial management, we just can't turn around without another rule we must adhere to.
He has erected a multitude of new offices and sent hither swarms of officials to harass our people and eat out their substance.
Sounds like a very familiar document. It might be the Declaration of Independence.
That was one of the indictments of George III.
That's right.
Bureaucratic overreach is something that's been going on for a long time. The American founders believed that they had figured out the cure for that, and that was the separation of powers that we all know in school. They realized that when the executive, legislative, and judicial powers are all in the same hands, that is the foundation for tyranny. Madison's words, not lightly stated, the foundation for tyranny. So what the American founders did was to meticulously separate those powers. I like to call it Mother's Rule. Mother's Rule, you've got two hungry brothers, one slice of pie. How does Mother slice the pie so both brothers are happy? One slices, the other chooses. The powers accorded to one check the ambitions of the other. One can't abuse his powers because of the powers given to the other. That's what the American founders did. They separated those powers. One brother makes law but cannot enforce it. The other brother enforces law but cannot make it. And Mother, in the form of the Supreme Court, is there to assure that those rules are followed. That was the design of the American founders. You look at the rise of the modern administrative state, these great bureaucracies that have grown up over the past 100 years. What we have done here is to take the powers the American founders meticulously separated and recombine them into the same hands. That's the fundamental problem. The same agency that legislates, that makes the law, makes the rule in this case, also enforces that law. So those two powers have now been recombined. And then if you run afoul of that law, you appear not before a federal court with all the due process rights you are accorded under our Constitution. You appear before an agency court run by the same agency that wrote the law, that's accused you of breaking that law, and by the way, in most cases, gets to keep the fines it assesses on you. That is Madison was right. That is the foundation of tyranny, and we are seeing those powers abused more and more. A lot of the blame, I think, should be assigned to the Congress, which has improperly given both legislative and judicial powers to the executive. This Congress is determined to reverse that process. Okay. I've made several proposals using our power to reauthorize existing agencies, to go back and do a meticulous house cleaning of these agencies, to assure that their role is strictly to enforce laws that the legislative branch has made, and that any disputes are not resolved by an agency judge, but are resolved by the federal courts with the due process rights people are accorded.
Fantastic, and wow, you really, really nailed the lesson here on principle, and that if these principles are not adhered to, then things just run afoul quite quickly, right? So you're working on this subject already, and glad to hear you're kind of out in front and leading the charge on it. Is there likelihood of success that we're going to see reform?
Well, again, that becomes a matter of political will, and that has yet to be seen. The House has a very good rule that's been on the books since the 1830s, that Congress shall make no appropriation except for purposes authorized by law. And yet about 1/3 of the appropriations we now make to federal agencies are for purposes not authorized by law. In a lot of cases, these are agencies whose authorities had expired years, sometimes even decades ago. And yet, in contravention of our own rules, we keep shoveling money at them. How can we do this? Well, there are rules, so we just, as boilerplate language in every measure that comes to the floor, those rules are simply waived. We need to enforce those rules. That would require every authorizing committee in the Congress to fulfill its responsibility to look at these programs, ask what works about them, what doesn't work about them, are they still fulfilling their goals, how much are they costing us, and also in that process to strip away the legislative and the judicial authorities that have been improperly accorded them over the years. That requires a backbone we have not yet found among House Republicans, but I think it's absolutely essential if we are to restore the constitutional balance that the American founders envisioned, because it is that separation of powers that's protected our liberty for almost 250 years.
I think this is terribly interesting, not just to me, but to our viewers, because we see Washington not working and we don't understand exactly why. And what you've just laid out is why things aren't working here. We continue to shovel money to agencies that, where you say their authority is expired, perhaps even decades ago. And I guess my follow-up to that would be, is it because there's essentially money involved for these districts of representatives who they would not like to see these agencies not receive the money?
The argument you'll hear is, sure, that applies to a lot of superannuated agencies, but it also applies to the Coast Guard, to the Department of State. You don't suggest that we ought to stop funding the Coast Guard and the Department of State, and the answer is, of course not. I expect the authorizing committees to look at these agencies and to reauthorize them. But while you're at it, strip them of any legislative or judicial powers that have been granted them. That's not the blueprint of the Constitution, and we have seen through bitter experience what happens when those powers are recombined in one agency.
Fascinating. Thank you very much for the work on that. And I hope you have tremendous success there, because the burden is...
We have a very long way to go.
Yeah. Well,
I wish I could tell you we're making lots of progress. I can tell you this. I think in the last few years the House has stopped according new authorities to these agencies. That's the good news.
Okay.
But we've got an awful lot of repairs to do if the founders' vision is to be restored.
Right. Well, we've had many years and decades of doing things wrong, and we can't.
And here we are. And again, these aren't ideologies disconnected from reality. The reason the Constitution's written the way it is because it works, and it works well when it's abided by. And when we stop abiding by it, things start to break down, sometimes rather quickly.
The Freedom Caucus, for example, in the House, it oftentimes comes under fire for not compromising principle and coming around to almost like giving the Democrats more of what they want.
That's exactly the problem.
Yeah, and so they get villainized as the bad guys for adhering to these principles.
Look, I was an original member of that group. I left it for precisely that reason, because their hearts are in the right place. But as a practical matter, time and time again, they have assisted the Democrats in blocking the reforms that are necessary to restore these constitutional principles we've been talking about, restore the conservative policies we've been talking about. They were one of the major stumbling blocks on health care reform, just as the most recent example. I tell folks, Benjamin Franklin once described John Adams this way. He said, "Mr. Adams has the best interests of our country at heart. He is always an honest man, often a wise one. But in some things, and at some times, he is completely out of his senses." And that's the way I describe the Freedom Caucus.
Okay, so that actually has been a hindrance.
Yeah, it's painful for me to say, because I was one of the founding members of it. But I observed over the first few months that it had become as well placed as their intentions are, one of the major obstacles to enacting conservative policy.
Okay.
And that's why I left them quite publicly almost 2 years ago now. And again, we can see that in their recent actions on measures like health care.
Well, let's move to the topic of the budget and some of the priorities you see there. What are kind of your top priorities? We see what the media is reporting as far as Republican top priorities, but what do you see that the Congress needs to really focus on, and possibly what is reasonably practical of getting changed into the budget?
The national debt, I believe, is our single greatest peril as a nation. You may remember a few years ago, Admiral Mike Mullen, then the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, warned that in his professional military judgment, the greatest threat to our national security, he said, was the national debt. And I remind folks that was when the national debt was about $6 trillion smaller than it is today. And the reason why that is such a threat is severalfold, but let me give you two of the principal reasons. On our current spending trajectory, within 4 years' time, the Congressional Budget Office warns that we will again be running trillion-dollar annual budget deficits. Now, that means that we are borrowing $1 trillion a year. Guess who gets to pay that back? You, the taxpayer. How much is $1 trillion? You divide the number of households in this country into $1 trillion. It comes to, if you're an average family paying average taxes, it means $8,000 a year has just been added to your credit card statement. There's nothing theoretical about that number. That is just as real as if it appeared at the bottom of your Visa or MasterCard statement this month. $8,000 that you're actually required to pay back through your future taxes before you even get to your credit card statement. That's why we have an IRS, and they're very good in insisting that you do. So that's the magnitude of the problem. Now, obviously, that does two things right off the bat. It crowds out the capital market. When government's borrowing that money is no longer available for loans to consumers to make consumer purchases, to home buyers to make home purchases. It's no longer available to businesses seeking to expand. And it robs the future of their ability to prosper because they have to pay back all of the loans that this generation has taken out. We all know from our personal experience, if you live beyond your means today, you're going to have to live below your means tomorrow. But those aren't the biggest threats to our country. Threat number one is this. The economists are warning us that we get up to trillion-dollar budget deficits again with the amount of debt we're now carrying, we risk a sovereign debt crisis. That's when the government loses access to capital markets. That's when capital markets, where we go to borrow all of this money, say, we're not sure you can pay all of this back. You're getting in a little over your head. I think we're going to pass on this bond sale. Well, when that happens, pension systems implode, basic services like law enforcement begin to rapidly decay, and the economy collapses. If you want to know what a sovereign debt crisis looks like, Venezuela is going through that right now. Even within our own territory, the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico is now going through that. It is a ugly, terrible thing. And we're 4 years away from setting the stage to run that sort of risk with our debt. The biggest problem, though, is this. 2 years after that, interest costs on the national debt. This is just what we're paying to rent money we've already spent. It goes for no other purpose. It's just paying interest on stuff we've already spent. That will exceed our entire defense budget. Now, you cannot provide for the common defense or promote the general welfare if you can't pay for it. And the ability of our country to do so is now being called into grave question by the debt and the annual deficits that add every year to that debt. That is why the budget is so important. The House Budget Committee has passed a measure that slowly changes that spending trajectory. Within 10 years, it will balance the budget and then start paying down this enormous debt that we've accumulated. But we're running out of time to fix this, and every year we delay, the problem becomes more intractable. We get closer to the insolvency of the Social Security system, which would collapse an entire generation of Americans who've been promised retirement benefits. Even before that, we will see the collapse of the Medicare system. According to the trustees, that's going to bankrupt, I believe, in 2029. We're talking about 12 years from now. Yeah. If we get to that point, having run trillion-dollar deficits and bearing interest costs that exceed our entire defense establishment. That's how bad the situation is. That's why this budget is so important.
Well, in the $20 trillion of publicly funded debt we're looking at as the budget as our national debt right now obviously does not include the entitlement liabilities that you're speaking of with
Correct.
Social Security and Medicare. We're well over $100 trillion, and as important people notice that.
And that debt exceeds our entire economy right now.
Right. Yeah. Now, that said, when we're looking at this $1 trillion a year budget deficit that you're kind of projecting out, we're looking at Social Security and Medicare deficits as well in that $1 trillion,
right.
correct?
No. Well, sort of.
Sort of. It's if the trust fund was not. If what we took in Social Security was not covering what we paid out,
well, that's already the case.
Yeah.
The thing is, we borrowed money from Social Security when it was running a surplus years ago. Now we're paying that money back. Social Security is in a condition of chronic deficit right now. It is already paying out more than it's taking in through payroll taxes.
Is that deficit in that $1 trillion, or is that an accrued liability?
Sort of.
Okay.
That's considered intragovernmental debt. In order to pay that back, since we don't have the money to pay it back, we go out and borrow money from the public. So our debt held by the public increases. That's what puts pressure on the capital markets as we pay off that intragovernmental debt. It doesn't affect that $20 billion figure you just cited. That's the total amount of debt both to the public and to the trust funds. But it is once that borrowing is paid off in 2032, 2033, then Social Security is insolvent. And at that point, it will trigger an immediate across-the-board reduction in pension payments to Social Security recipients who have been promised these benefits all of these years. They'd see about a 20 to 30% immediate reduction in their checks. So that's what we need to protect against. And once again, time's not our ally. Every year we delay on that. Every year we delay in the impending implosion of the Medicare system. The problems become all the more intractable because we're running out of time.
Right. Yeah. And now, right now, when we look at our budget, just Social Security and Medicare, what about 2/3 of the budgetary spending? That comes out?
Just a thumbnail of we spend about $4 trillion a year. $2 trillion of that is the trust fund, Social Security and Medicare mainly. Okay. So that leaves a pot of $2 trillion left. Roughly $1 trillion is discretionary spending. That's what Congress fights over every year. That's what the appropriations bills are all about. That's what all the fights in Washington are all about. Then there's an additional roughly $1 trillion, very rough numbers, that is it's called mandatory spending. Congress does not appropriate that money year by year. That money just goes out the door anytime somebody comes in with a claim on it. It's mainly the welfare systems, food stamps, and that entitlement spending that is not supported by payroll taxes. That is what's eating us alive. We've actually brought down our discretionary spending somewhat from about $1.3 trillion in 2010 to about $1.17 trillion now. It's the mandatory spending that is growing like topsy and it's eating us alive. That's got to be brought under control. Our budget does that. It includes reconciliation instructions for an initial $200 billion of mandatory spending reductions over the next 10 years. That's what starts to bend that trajectory that's back toward balance within the decade rather than the path to bankruptcy that we're currently on.
Well, you spoke at a recent budget committee hearing. You spoke on the subject of some of this mandatory spending and the war on poverty and essentially its failure over the last 40 years. We haven't achieved the goal, and yet we've allocated all these resources to it. You interestingly stated that business taxes, for example, aren't borne by the business. They're borne one of three ways, either by higher prices for the consumer or by lower wages for an employee or by lower returns for investors, right?
Which is mainly 401ks, your pension funds.
Of course, which is a great middle-class America.
Yeah.
With their retirement plans, pension plans, IRAs. Now, the Democrats seem to be just fine with the lower returns to investors, and they seem to I have this idea that, well, we'll deal with these higher prices through subsidies, and we'll deal with lower wages through minimum wage, almost as if they can, through an act of legislation, decide how the markets are supposed to behave.
Well, the subsidies come from your taxes, so
of course.
Let's make that clear.
Right.
And unfortunately, if it was possible to raise income simply by government fiat, why are we stopping at $15 an hour for the minimum wage? Why don't we do $50 or $100? The sad fact of the matter is, if you're just starting out in a field, your labor might not be worth $15 an hour to the employer. You might be in that entry-level position producing less than $15 an hour, which means if the minimum wage is 15 and your labor is actually worth 10, you've just been made permanently unemployable by government fiat. Let me tell you a story of my son. He got his degree in computer engineering. It took him 2 years to land the job of his dreams in that industry. In that 2-year period, he wanted to be independent, God bless him. He went out and got a job at the local Food Max, and he started earning at the minimum wage. Rents a place in Chico with a bunch of his friends, and they're all scrimping and saving, gets his first raise after a few months of hard work, gets a second raise. Very, very proud of that. It's not his field, not what he wants to do. He's out there looking for a job in the field, but in the meantime, this is an employer saying, you matter to me, we want to pay you more because you're generating more for us. It's just a matter of great pride with him. It wasn't a lot of money. It was a great pride. When they raised the minimum wage, 2 things happened. He and all of the co-workers that had poured their hearts into that job, who had gotten the raises, suddenly find those raises no longer mean anything because entry-level positions coming in are now being paid the same as the folks that had a year and a half of experience in that job. The other thing that happened is they cut back on all of the wages, all of the hours of the employees, and our son and his friends actually ended up earning less because they had raised the minimum wage. That's how it works in the real world. And that's one of the great tragedies of leftist economics. Sounds great on paper, does not work in practice.
That's exactly right, yeah. Fantastic economics lesson here, in that we need to understand that these policies have real-world implications for people in their lives and what they're experiencing.
It robs them, and again, as my son experienced, it robs them of the dignity of earning a living, of earning your worth. And it robs them of their actual wages because the slack's got to be taken up somewhere, and they did it by cutting back hours.
Is there the political will with Republicans in Congress to act on some of this mandatory spending, some of the welfare and
We're about to
food
find
stamps?
out. We are about to find out whether or not we have the votes for the budget. Now, again, the budget passed unanimously out of the Budget Committee. We expect to take it up when we return in September. If that is adopted, of course, it will go over to the Senate. The Senate will still have to act on it. Both houses will have to agree. But if they agree on something similar to what the House has already passed out of the Budget Committee, it means we will actually be able, for the first time in many, many years, to start bringing our mandatory spending under control. And when people say, oh, you just want to cut back food stamps for poor people. No, not at all. What we do want to do is get people back to work. One of the most important reforms that Bill Clinton approved in 1996 that has since been rolled back is a work requirement. Yes, we want to be, we want to support those who are in a rough spot in their lives, but we want to ask certain things of them in return. We ask that they look for work, or at least train for work, and if the job's offered, they take that job. I don't think that that's an unreasonable request. And when we did that, what we found, and other states are now doing, Maine, for example, has just restored that requirement, dramatic reduction in people claiming food stamps. Because, if I have to work, to get my SNAP, I might as well actually go to work. And
now, I seem to recall that in the mid-'90s, I think the Republican Revolution in 1994, there was a contract with America. I believe I have my year correct.
Yep.
Part of that contract with America, there was some welfare reform.
Right.
And wasn't there a timeline set of maybe a couple of years of benefits? Was it 5 years of benefits? And did we not see a reduction in welfare rolls as a result of that? People understanding they needed to go to work?
We didn't see it in California, because California came in and said, oh, don't worry about that. We'll underwrite it. So we saw a big increase in welfare costs for California, and California did not see the decline in welfare rolls that many other states saw. But you're absolutely right. That was one of the requirements. And by the way, not just a Republican requirement. After he took the drubbing in 1994, Bill Clinton went before the Congress. And you recall his State of the Union address right after that election. He says, the era of big government is over. And he made good on that. And one of the ways he made good on that was the welfare reform. He said, we ended welfare as we know it. It was no longer an unconditional guarantee of support. We asked certain things. If you were able-bodied and able to make your own way, we asked that you at least try to do that. And most people did. And the welfare rolls were reduced dramatically. We could then focus additional resources on those who simply could not lift themselves up, and it worked. Welfare costs came down. Employment went up. We had a period of remarkable economic expansion toward the later half of the Clinton administration, and that was one of the reasons.
Well, yeah, can you speak to then treatment of Medicaid, for example, in the budget? How is that also something that's going to see some cuts?
Well, again, one of the things is Obamacare brought in an entire population of able-bodied recipients into the Medicaid system. The Medicaid system was intended for those who were injured, disabled,
right.
or elderly. Elderly, blind, or disabled, I think, was the criteria. Obamacare brought in a whole group of perfectly able-bodied people, and here was the difference. The federal government still reimburses the states for the aged, blind, and disabled for 50%. So they get 50% underwritten by the federal government. The state has to come up with the other 50%. Obamacare, the able-bodied recipients, they're subsidized at a 90% federal rate. Guess who gets first in line for Medicaid services when they're available? Right. And what also has happened is it's flooded the Medicaid markets, and it's becoming harder and harder to find providers who will actually accept Medicaid, which crowds out the population for which Medicaid was originally entitled. One of the reforms that we're calling for is, again, if you're able-bodied on Medicaid, same thing. We want you to actively look for work, and if you find a job, if a job's offered to you, we ask that you take that job. And once again, that has worked in the states that have been granted waivers to employ that provision. We just need to do it across the board.
You know, you're speaking of providers who will accept Medicaid, kind of reminded me of that there are some providers who won't accept Medicare any longer because Medicare won't reimburse for the rising cost of health care has essentially priced out Medicare payments. And,
correct.
So just to add to the point of that, this fixing of this healthcare system.
Which is why Medicare reform is also so important, right. And the budget calls for that, has for the last 5 budgets that we've adopted, and it comes down to this. It's modeled on the the Medicare Advantage system, which a lot of people already prefer to standard Medicare. And what it means is you have this long list of different plans that have been pre-negotiated with Medicare. You pick the plan that best meets your own needs, and then Medicare comes in and underwrites that premium depending upon how old you are, how sick you are, and how poor you are. That would put Medicare back on a sound financial footing and guarantee it for the next generation. As it is, the Medicare trustees tell us 2029, I believe, is the current date that they will go insolvent, and that's not, that's what 12 years from now. So I mean, just do the math on that. That's 12 years from now. So if you're 53 or younger, on our current trajectory, Medicare's not going to be there for you.
Wow.
So those who say, oh, don't you dare touch Medicare, what they're actually saying is we're perfectly all right with it collapsing in 12 years on an entire generation of Americans who've been promised these benefits and have presumably made all of their saving and investment decisions based upon these promises.
Very true, very true. Congressman, we could talk, I think, for hours, and I'm thankful, so thankful for all this fantastic information you've shared with me and with our viewers. Fortunately, we have to end this episode. Folks, this was our Congressman, Tom McClintock, joining us again and sharing with us what's going on in Washington. Thank you for viewing, and we really appreciate you being here.
It's my pleasure. Thank you again.
Yeah.